Well, you make me laugh, man. In a good way, in a good way. So, the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this idea of surviving and thriving in an ungodly culture. Just that idea, the more that we look around, the more that we see society around us, the more it's evident, the more obvious it is that we live in an ungodly culture. I mean, it's just the more you look around, the more it is. But we don't want to just survive that culture. We really believe that Jesus has said that He wants us to thrive in Him and in a relationship with Him. In fact, John 10:10 says, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And it's that I've come that they may have life and have it to the full that I really believe that He means He wants us to thrive. It may not be what we think of thriving, but He wants us to thrive in our relationship with Him. So the first week, we looked at how powerful prayer can be, how Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream that he had and interpret that dream all through prayer between Daniel and his friends. But they didn't just leave it at prayer. They gave the glory to God in that. They gave all the credit to God, not themselves, for Daniel being able to interpret this dream. Then last week we looked at the idea of taking a stand when culture tells us that we need to worship something other than God. Whether that means something along with God or just get rid of God altogether and bow down to something else. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were our characters last week, and they were unwilling to bow to anything. They were unwilling to worship anything other than God. No matter what it cost them, no matter what Nebuchadnezzar threatened to do to them, and he threatened a lot, didn't he? He threatened to throw them into the fiery furnace, and he didn't just threaten it, he followed through with it. But they stood up and said, "We will not worship, we will not bow down to anything but God, and we know that our God can, and we believe He will save us. But even if He doesn't, we still put our faith and trust in God." This week we're going to continue. We're going to wrap up this series, but we're going to look at this idea again of surviving and thriving in that ungodly culture. Now, I just have a question for you to begin with. Have you ever had anyone that just flat out lied about you behind your back for whatever reason, one way or another, whether to gain something for themselves or to get you in trouble? Have you ever had somebody that just flat out lied about you? I was working at Lowe's at one point in my life. I was running the returns desk, and it was a brand new Lowe's. I helped open the store, and the returns and cashiers were all under their direct supervisor was called the head cashier, and then it went up to the operations manager from that. Well, there were a couple of head cashiers, and one that was really nice, I got along with really well, and I thought she was trying to help me get better in my job and not promoted, but move up, get more hours, that type of thing. But a lot of the managers in the store really didn't look at me like I was doing my job or doing well. I interviewed for a couple of different positions, and they were surprised at how well I did in the interview. And then what I found out was that this head cashier that was great to my face and had great conversations with had been telling her bosses how poor of a job I was doing because I think she was scared that I would end up taking her job at some point, which I had no purpose in staying there. I was just there until I found a ministry, so I didn't really care about how far I advanced, but I was being basically stabbed in the back by somebody that I thought was a friend. What about you? Again, I started with that question. Have you ever been stabbed in the back? Or what about, have you ever been attacked just for being a Christian? You're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to handle yourself the best way that you can, and others just can't seem to get or handle the fact that you believe or that you live differently than they do. And because of that, they attack. Or you're living and working with such excellence that they want to tear you down. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Well, that's exactly what happens to Daniel in our story today in our main text. We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 6. But let me give you just a little bit of background about what was going on that led up to this. So Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon when Daniel and his friends were taken from Israel and arrived. They were promoted to pretty high up in our first story. They were over a lot of the kingdom because Nebuchadnezzar trusted him. Nebuchadnezzar was the one that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace, but he learned to believe in God a lot more after that fact too. But now we come to Daniel 6, and Nebuchadnezzar's gone. He's not in the picture anymore. In fact, another nation is now controlling Babylon, so there's a new king in town. And Daniel was appointed as one of 3 that were in charge of the kingdom under Darius. And he did things with such excellence that Darius was ready to promote him even higher than that, to put him in charge of the entire kingdom. So instead of being one of 3, he was going to be the one directly under Darius. But there were about 100 or 120 that were under him that didn't like that very much. But they couldn't find anything wrong with Daniel. They couldn't find any way to tear him down. They tried. There was no corruption. There was no negligence. There was nothing that they could find to bring against Daniel to Darius. And the others in charge, again, those satraps, those people that were in charge under Daniel, knew that they would never get promoted if Daniel stayed. They desperately looked for ways to bring him down. But again, they could find nothing against him. Until one day they decided to set him up. They decided to make a rule to get him in trouble. And they went to Darius. And we'll pick up with that in Daniel 6, verses 6 through 9 to begin with. It says, so these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. You see, they set him up from the beginning. They knew that Daniel would never follow along with this, that he would never stop praying to God. And they got it set up through Darius without telling Darius what they were doing, but they had it set up in such a way that he could never repeal the order if he found out what was going on, because the rules of the Medes and Persians say if the king puts an edict in writing, it can't be changed. So the king put that in the writing that for the next 30 days, if anyone prayed to anyone other than him, they would be thrown into the lion's den. So picking up in verse 10 through 12, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So Daniel knew about the decree. It says that when he learned about it, this was the first thing he did, is he went and prayed. Now, he didn't go stand on the street corner praying. He went to his own room, to his own private home. But it didn't stop him from doing what he knew to be the best thing, which was communicating with his God, communicating with God. But they knew that he wouldn't stop either, and they went and they caught him. Verse 13 through 18 says, "Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel, made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace, spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So Darius liked Daniel. Darius was set up in this too. But he couldn't change. He couldn't change the edict because of the laws of the land. He could not change this when he realized what had happened. These guys seemed to have the perfect plan to tear Daniel down, to get rid of him. And Darius didn't want to do it. He tried to find ways to get Daniel out of it. And when he couldn't even sleep at night because of what he had just done. Picking up at 19, at first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. So I think on some point or some way, Darius kind of believed that maybe Daniel was going to be okay. He went and rushed as soon as the rule had elapsed. And he could go check on him. He did. Found Daniel completely unharmed. It's kind of familiar with the same way with the fiery furnace. They came out completely unharmed, no smell of smoke. Daniel didn't even have a scratch on him. Now, I really find it interesting what Darius did after this. Verse 24 through 28 says, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Ouch. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lion's den." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel stood up. He did what was right. He did what he knew was right, which was to continue praying to God, even though the king had made a decree that anyone prays to anybody other than the king would die. Daniel didn't care. He stood up for what he knew was right, what he knew in his heart was supposed to be, which was praying to God on a daily basis. Christianity has been the mainstream religion in this country for a long time. Our country was founded on the idea of religious freedom, and that's great. And along with that, Christianity has been the main group of that. But it was founded with the idea of being able to worship freely. We're living in a culture that Christianity being the mainstream has started to shift a little bit, though. It's not necessarily where it was. Back in the 50s, the 60s, later, not going to church was looked on as living on the fringe of society. If you didn't go to church, you were kind of an outcast. But that started to shift. Now sometimes going to church is looked on as living on the fringe of society. Those of us that go to church on a regular basis can be looked at as outcasts in some parts, not every place in this country yet, but in some that is definitely happening. And that shift is continuing to happen. It's getting more and more like that. There are different groups that are now being attacked or looked down upon simply because they try to follow Jesus. Or they're not willing to compromise their beliefs for someone else. But I have to ask this. Why does that surprise us? It really shouldn't surprise us at all. Because Christianity, following Christ, is simply and has always been about following Jesus. And he was definitely someone who went against the norms of society. In fact, we talked about that in our Sunday school class this morning. He didn't follow the traditions and the ideas of the elders if they didn't follow what God had put in place. He didn't necessarily just follow culture. He challenged the common thoughts of the day. He invited 12 uneducated men to follow him instead of trying to select the best of the best in the eyes of everyone else. He started conversations with women, which was unheard of to start a conversation with a woman outside of your own family. But on top of that, he also started conversations and had Samaritans as the heroes of some of his stories, which was even more uncalled for. He ate with sinners and tax collectors. And then he went on and told us and his disciples to not be surprised when the world hates us because we're trying to follow him. John 15, 18 through 25, John recorded this. He says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If you obeyed my teaching, they will obey your. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated me, both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason." And as I read that, I think John, who recorded that for us, I think he took that teaching to heart. I think he took that idea to heart, because not only did he record Jesus' words there and made it important for us to hear those, he also wrote the following in 1 John 3, 11 through 15. He says, "For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He continued, "We know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him." So here's the question I have for you as we wrap up this series. Here's what all of this really comes down to. Do we want to be liked by the world? Or do we want to follow Jesus? Sometimes it's really as simple as that. Do we want to be liked by the world, or do we want to follow Jesus? Now, I'm not saying that we go out and we purposely tick people off and start fights, because that's not something that Jesus would have done lovingly either. But we need to focus on Jesus and our relationship with Him and what He has called us to do. We should be different than the world around us instead of looking exactly like the world around us. And we should be ready for the world to hate us because of it. They're going to hate us because we're living differently than them, living with a purpose and a hope that they just don't understand. It's no secret, the world around us is dying, and there are people going to hell daily because they don't know Jesus. And if we live in a relationship with Jesus, but we look just like the world around them, they're never going to realize the need for Jesus. So how do we stand? How do we survive? And how do we thrive in a world that doesn't know God? We have to stand out and be different than the world around us. We have to live for God and not care what other people think in that regards. If we're living for God and putting our faith in Him, we are going to look different than the world around us. And that's okay. That's what we're called to do. We're called to stand out. We're called to bring others to Him. We're called to show them that there's a better way at this hard, hard life. That's what Daniel did. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They stood out in a culture that they were forced into, that they didn't have any say in. They still stood out. They stood firm in their faith. And they won kings to their side. Now, we don't know what those kings' relationships actually were with God, but they at least issued decrees that they need to be supportive of the God of Daniel and the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that's the same God that we serve today. May be tough at times. We may be faced with very hard decisions at times. But if we look at God first and foremost, it may not be easy in the eyes of the world, but it's better by far. If you have any decision to make this morning, now's the time to do so. As we stand and sing the first and second verse of I Am Thine, O Lord, from 552.